Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill George, and we'll get the session started. Jamie Dimon is on his way. We have four outstanding individuals to take on a very challenging subject, crisis, community, and leadership. And I think we can all readily agree that with the crisis we face, the fiscal crisis in the world, the many crises we have in terms of world peace and local conflicts, problems with the environment and energy and healthcare, that leadership is absolutely critical, and that in many cases we can attribute the problems we're facing to poor leadership or failed leadership. We have four people with us today who can really speak to this question. In my experience, I have found that you never know how effective a leader is until they're tested in a crisis situation. It's easy to look good when things are good, but it's really in that crisis that you find out, are they going to hold true to their principles, their values, and lead their organization through that situation. And the real test is, can you stay true to that? And of course, in the United States, we have a new leader, and President Obama taking over, and there's a great test going on there as well. So we're going to have the opportunity to hear from four people who can, I think, enlighten us tremendously. Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu is on my immediate right, who is the leader of Israel's Likud party and has served as prime minister from 1996 to 1999. And on my immediate left, Mr. David Cameron, the leader of the United Kingdom's Conservative Party. And then on my far left, Anna Botín, who is a member of the Spain's Grupo Santander and also head of Banesto Bank. And then on my far right, Jamie Dimon, who is, as you know, chairman and CEO of JPMorgan Chase. And so I think we have the opportunity to hear from two people from, if you will, the political arena, government arena, and two from the business arena. But in effect, we're all facing the same kinds of problems. So Benjamin, maybe I can start with you. I think the obvious question was to ask you about Gaza and all the threats on your borders. But I think I'd rather go back to the time about 5 years ago when you came in as finance minister and were facing a crisis, if you will. Your economy was down. It declined about 7% in the previous 2 years. And what you learned from that experience with your elections coming up on February 10th, how you might take some of those learnings if you are restored to the position of Prime Minister of Israel, how you might take some of those learnings into facing the challenges you currently face on your borders as well as in the economic crisis, if you would.
Thank you, and good morning. I think that a recapitulation of what happened there, I think, might be useful, at least to draw some general conceptions about what direction do you need in times of crisis. The crisis we faced was at the time the most severe economic crisis that Israel faced in decades. Perhaps the only other one was the Six-Day War, the period leading to the Six-Day War where we had a similar recession. This one actually exceeded it. So it was a very, very serious crisis. We had intifada, terror, tourism effectively stopping. People wouldn't go to cafes, commerce at a halt. We had the NASDAQ that had burst, and a lot of our high-tech just plummeted. And so this is the time that I came in as finance minister, which was an odd choice to take on that position at the time. And I thought that there were three things that were required for us to get out of it. One was a clear vision of the problem and the solution. What was the problem? What's the solution? It has to be a very, very clear vision. I'll get back to that, because without that, you're nowhere. The second is to have sufficient political power to drive the vision, translated into a very concrete program, drive it through the political system. And the third is political courage, because no matter how clear your vision is, and even if you have political power, you're still going to get hit. So unless you have the threes, the big three, the vision, the power, and the guts to do it, it's just not going to do it. It's not going to happen. The vision that I saw, the way that I saw the problem, was different from what I've just described to you. That is, everybody saw what I just described, the collapse of the NASDAQ, the terror that we had, and people naturally assumed that the crisis that we had of a sinking economy, shrinking really, shrinking not only in GDP, shrinking in GDP per capita. So our standard of living was collapsing in 2 successive years. We couldn't raise a penny on the international markets, and the international bankers kindly told us not to try, so the word wouldn't get out that they refused us and so on. I mean, we were in 11, 12% unemployment, growing. So we were in a bad way. I didn't think the problem were just exogenous factors. They certainly contributed to it. And this relates to what we see now. If you think the problem is exogenous, basically, then you will never get over the average of your competitors. If you think I'm going to be only as good as the outside conditions allow me to be, you're never going to excel. And you'll never do a particularly good job of anything, because if you say, well, it's the world, what can I do? You don't get very far. I didn't think that. I had seen other countries that had been behind us in per capita income well before the NASDAQ had burst, well before the Intifada terror had burst out, before these additional blows to our economies took place. I had seen that other countries had overtaken us. And they were about our size. Singapore, overtaken us. They were behind us 20 years earlier. Spain, skip the high tech. Spain, overtaken us in per capita income. Ireland, forget it. And so on. And I said, what is it that they were doing that we had not done before? And can we use the crisis, and this is an important point, can you use the crisis to effect structural changes that make, in my case, make my country, Israel, more competitive, so that when we come out of the crisis, we'll actually have improved our position? And I thought I had to communicate this analysis that said that we had structural problems in the Israeli economy, in addition to the other problems that we had faced in the technology markets and terror, that we needed to fix. And the way I communicated this, and this is, if you have a vision, you better be able to communicate it very, very simply to the electorate. So I chose to do this in a simple story, because the voters, at least in my country, are not intuitive economists. And anyway, economics is not an intuitive profession. It's counterintuitive, as you know, in many, many parts of it. So I decided to have a story. And the story that I described introducing our economic plan was of my first day in paratrooper basic training. And it was, they put us on a big field and placed in a line. And they told us to pair up. And I was the first man on the left, and I turned to the man on my right, put him on my shoulders, pretty heavy guy. The next guy was the smallest man in the platoon, and he got the heaviest guy in the platoon on his shoulders. And the third guy was a big guy, and he got someone small. And then the commander blew the whistle, and now we take this race. It's called the elephant race. And I barely could take a few steps forward. The little guy with the big guy on his back collapsed on the spot, and the third guy, the big guy, just ran, shot off like a rocket and took the race. And I said, in the international economy, all national economies are pairs of a public sector sitting on the shoulders of a private sector. And in our case, the public sector got enormous, very heavy, and we were going to collapse like the little guy below. We had come up to about 55% of GDP in the public sector, and we were going to collapse. We were very close to collapse. So the solution to this, in order to win the race or improve our position in the race vis-a-vis the other countries, we would have to put the fat guy on a diet, on a stringent diet. Very hard to do politically, David, as you know. The second thing we had to do was make the guy at the bottom very fit, very, very fit, which means put a lot of oxygen in his lungs, and that means three things: lowering taxes, and lowering taxes. That got us into a big argument, which has been settled since. And the third thing was, even if you've reduced the fat man and you've really got the thin man fit, and now he can go and run, and he wants to run, he sees a fence, stops. There's a puddle, stops. There's a wall, stops, barbed wire, and so on. The barriers to competition are going to hold back a private sector that is carrying a streamlined public sector, so you've got to remove the barriers to competition. So we came out of that with three things that we were going to do. We were going to control government spending, we were going to reduce taxes, and we were going to remove competition. I don't want to get into the whole story. It involved also reforms in the capital markets, in our ports, our pension system. While we were at it, we cleaned that up. Our people said to me in the finance ministry, Mr. Minister, you can't do that because you can't do this reform because if you do, you're going to get a general strike, labor strike, for each one of these reforms. And I said, could you say that again? They said, yeah, you're going to get a general strike for each one of these reforms. I said, well, that's very good. That means if we do them all at once, we could maximize the number of reforms per strike. And that's what we did. We did batches of 8 right from the start, 8 and then another 8 and so on. And the result has been that the Israeli economy has grown at about 5% and more a year for the last 5 years. And we entered this crisis better than most countries. And if we act right, we can use this crisis to exit from it earlier. So if I had to put it, the 3 things that you need to do, you have to set a vision and a program, communicate it very clearly. You have to have political power. We enjoyed that power at the time. And you have to have the guts to do this because to go against organized labor was very, very costly. To go against the major banks, because we took a lot of their powers, especially in the savings, very, very costly. To go against your own constituencies in reforming welfare, the most costly. And as a result, I have to report to you that I paid a price. So it was one of the reasons we lost the last elections. But it may be one of the reasons we stand a good chance to win this current elections in a few days, because people appreciate the fact that we actually did something that was right, that was beyond us. Because politicians do speak of the good of the country, but the only way you really test leadership is if you're willing to, I don't want to say impale yourself, but if you're willing to actually pay political capital, your own, shed political blood, your own, in order to better the position of the countries. And voters have a surefire way of distinguishing leadership rhetoric from leadership. They really know how to do that. So that's as far as what we did. How are these 3 principles going to be used if we do make it to power now? First of all, set a vision. My vision is we can use this crisis, given the reforms we've already done, to complete them so that Israel within 10 years become one of the 10, at most 15 years, becomes one of the 10 most competitive economies in the world. Not in size, in per capita income, and in other indices of competition. I think it's perfectly possible. The second is to augment, to have a strong enough government. Well, we'll find out. But obviously I hope to be able to win and to be able, not really to win, but to have a government that's structured on this mission. Because I view the mission not merely as saving jobs and getting through the crisis. My mission and my vision is that we will use the crisis to come out in an enormously improved competitive position. We did about 40 reforms, 40 big reforms. There are 40 left. I know what they are. I want to do them now. And the third thing is obviously to have the guts to do it. Well, you're in it in order to do it. What do you sit in office for? Not to occupy the seat. It's totally useless and also uninteresting in the long run. In any case, that's what I think we need. Vision, political power, political courage, and each leader has to tailor that vision to your own national economy. Each nation state has abilities and advantages that are peculiar to that economy. And if you'd like, later on, I'll tell you what I think those are in my country.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very clear. And David, why don't you pick up from there? You've obviously been engaging debates with Prime Minister Brown about the future of the British economy and to the extent you're going to nationalize or personally nationalize the banks and how you're going to get out of this situation. Maybe if you and your party come to power and you're to take over as Prime Minister later this year, give us some insights into how you would lead.
Well, I think I'd like Bibi's metaphor about having a fitter private sector and a less wasteful public sector, but I've never been in the paratroopers, so I'm going to have to find a different story to back it up. I mean, the background in the UK is that we're facing the deepest recession for maybe 40 years, and also the deepest recession, according to the IMF figures, for any advanced country. And the other bit of background is obviously one party, the Labour Party, has been in power for more than the last decade, and so my party's been out of power. And so the challenge of leadership in a crisis, if we win the next election, is going to be huge. My answer is that I think what's required is a very big dose of realism, combined, I hope, with a big dose of hope. The realism, because there are no quick fixes. There are no magic bullets to solving the recession, and I think politicians need to say so. But the hope, because, we will come out of this, and we've got to make sure that we come out of this stronger. I think both those things, though, the realism and the hope, require a frankness and a candour and an honesty about how we got here, about how we're going to get out of this. I think if people don't believe your explanation for the problems you're in, they're never going to believe your cures and your ideas for how you get out of it. I think what Bibi said about, if you pretend it's all exogenous, if you pretend it's all beyond you, then why should anyone listen to you? If we spend all our time saying all of this recession, it all came from America, it's all subprime, it's all the fault of those estate agents, then we're missing a lot of the point, which is that we made mistakes in the UK, and I think we need politicians who are able to wipe the slate clean, which you can do after an election, and say, yes, look, the regulators failed, the bankers failed, the politicians failed, people themselves made mistakes in terms of over-leveraging, opposition politicians made mistakes, they should have been far, everyone, I think the need to wipe the slate clean and have a realism and an honesty and a frankness about the situation we're in. It'd be wonderful to hear a little bit more from leaders of the following short sentences. I got it wrong. Sometimes even in this circumstance, I don't know all the answers because I don't think anybody does. And also, that's not my idea, but I like it and I'm going to implement it. I think we need to hear those things a bit more from leaders. In terms of the realism, as I said, there's no one measure that's going to get us out of this. I think also there's a great danger of not hearing what Benjamin just said, which is that you've got to make sure you're clear about the real problem. And I think in the UK case, I think we've wasted a lot of time on cutting VAT, on fiscal stimuli, when actually we should have been focused on the real problem, which is the banks aren't lending. I'm a monetary activist, but a fiscal conservative. And I think that the fiscal measures just simply won't work unless we unblock the banking system. So I think we're going to be laser-like in our identification of the real problem, which is the nature of the credit crunch, and target our solutions at that. But even in that case, you asked the questions about nationalising the banks or bad banks, insurance schemes that we're trying in the UK. There's probably no one answer that is going to unblock this system. It's going to be a range of things, and they're going to take some time. In terms of hope, I think we've got to convince people that there will be a way out of this. We need to demonstrate that all the things we do now are not just good at alleviating the recession and helping people, but are also part of building a stronger economy for the future. So whether it is helping savers who've seen their incomes cut, that's good for now because you're helping people who see declining income, but it's good for the future because we need to encourage a culture of saving. Whether it's investment in green technology, that's good for now because it's jobs, but it's going to strengthen the economy for the future. I think those are important. Hope and focusing on the future, I think, is completely vital because in the end, what will get us out of this is a recovery of confidence. All the economist models in the world can describe to you how you can try and make up aggregate demand, but they don't really describe to you the real change in aggregate demand that comes when the consumers, the businesses, actually start thinking it's time to go and invest, it's time to start thinking about generating future investments, future profits, future jobs. And it's that unblocking of confidence that is the absolute key to this. Just a couple of last points that I'd make. I completely agree with what Benjamin said about courage. I think in politics, you particularly in difficult circumstances like these, you've absolutely got to be prepared to fail doing the right thing rather than just chopping away and taking the easy path and trying to survive in that way. In opposition, that's difficult to demonstrate because oppositions are there partly to oppose, to ask questions, to probe, to call a government to account. But actually in the UK, on the argument over the fiscal stimulus, actually we have taken a very aggressive stance, which is my view, is that borrowing 8% of your GDP, which Britain is this year, is too much. Therefore, we can't afford a fiscal stimulus. It might be right for other countries. It's not right for us. I think it undermines confidence because consumers aren't mugs and they can see that if you're going to spend a lot now, the taxes are going to go up in future, and that actually undermines confidence. Now, that's a difficult, and that's actually, it's much easier as an opposition politician to say, yes, of course, let's go on a spending spree. Let's cut the taxes. Let's boost the spending. Let's forget about tomorrow. We don't have to worry about that. The government should be doing more, should be spending more. I just think that would be completely wrong, and I hope it's a demonstration of the sort of courage you're going to need in office to say in opposition, actually, that may be the easy thing to do, but it's the wrong thing to do. And I think people are beginning to see in the UK that the biggest bit of our stimulus, which was cutting value-added tax, at a time when prices in the shops were plummeting anyway, was a crazy thing to do. It hasn't encouraged the consumer. It's just added a debt burden that our children are going to have to pay off. So the other last thing I want to say, I think, is leadership style. Clearly, in a crisis, you need very strong leadership, you need decisive leadership, you need that courage that is to say, I'm going to stick to this path and I'd rather fail doing the right thing than chop away and do the easy thing. But I think you also need a recognition that this is not a job for one man, just as you can't be a chairman or one woman. I hasten to add, and the last person to lead us out of a crisis in Britain was a woman, one who inspires me very much. But just as in business you shouldn't be your own chairman and chief executive, in politics you cannot be chairman, chief executive and chief financial officer. You've absolutely got to have that team. And if anything, because the role of the leader in bringing people together, in making the whole country feel we're all in this together, we're all going to get out of this together, in trying to bring that sense of confidence forward, you actually need quite a chairmanic approach rather than a sense that, as I think our Prime Minister sometimes is at the moment, is he's sort of chief financial officer, chief operating officer, chief everything officer, and that I think actually can give her the impression of frenetic activity, hyperactivity, that's also ineffective, and that's not a good combination.
Thank you, David. Jamie, let me turn to you. Both Benjamin and David talked about courage. You've certainly shown a lot of courage in stepping up to take over Bear Stearns on a weekend, I believe, without exactly 100% knowledge of what you're getting into, and then later over taking over Washington Mutual, which also had its own share of challenges. You're really at the center of the financial crisis in the U.S., sitting on top of the largest bank in the country. How do you see the kind of leadership that's required to get us through this crisis?
Yeah, so one of the things in crisis is that people say what happened in the crisis, but honestly, if you're not prepared beforehand, I think it almost doesn't matter. So, I was at a meeting one day, and a lady got up and talked about management and said, if you're a CEO or any kind of leader, the one thing you need is people around you who tell the truth. Someone around you, one person, who tells you the truth every time something goes on. And I got up and said, if you're a leader, you have 10 people around you, and only one is telling the truth, you have a real problem. And because everyone's got to do it. So, I'm Bear Stearns. I got a phone call on the night of March 13th. On my birthday, I was having dinner with my parents and my daughter and wife, and the chairman and CEO asked me, basically, can you lend me $30 billion by the end of the night? So I said, no, I cannot. And the press writes about the story about this financial engineering. You buy this company very cheap, and it wasn't the money; it was the extreme risk. I always compare buying that company to buying a house on fire. Financial companies implode, and as you know, we had not that much time to do due diligence. The beautiful part of the story is that the team, who I called, that Thursday night, around the world, people got dressed and went back to work, and it was like 9 or 10 o'clock at night. So thousands of people. Around the world, and now around the clock for those 3 or 4 days, and then in a room, not a room quite this big, we went through every part of the company, systems, ops, legal, compliance, all the trading books, and all the traders had to come in and what we thought and what we can write, what we can handle, and that's the beautiful part of the story. And and almost the same thing. One, we had much more time. But I think the people also had to know, by the way, that if we did this, it wasn't going to be going to come out afterwards and blame people. I think that one of the terrible things you see in corporate America, and the politics is even more of a contact sport, is when you see that people make mistakes and they're held high. They're blamed. They're hung high on the polls as if somehow it's their fault and no one else's fault. And I find it almost embarrassing when managements, have to blame people publicly. They embarrass them, they embarrass the family, they embarrass everyone. And I always say, well, where was the CEO? I mean, weren't they in the process? Didn't they put the people in the job? And people are going to make mistakes. And people, when they make mistakes, particularly when you're in a crisis like this, they're going to say, hey, I think this is worth $4 billion. You can't fire them if it's worth $3.9 billion. And so they have to know that you trust them, that you have their back, that that obviously if they don't deserve the job, you might move them out, but they have to know that you will be as indebted, as hardworking as they do, and take as much blame as they do, because honestly, at the end of the day, the boss is the most important. We went through, and now this crisis has been going on for a long time. It's getting kind of old. I hope when we come here next year, we're not talking about it anymore, although I wouldn't completely count on that if I were you. But now we're going through this crisis for a long time, but I think the leaders you have at the company, the people at JPMorgan Chase, like every single people who work for me, walked in at one point and said, hey, if I don't get paid, no problem. I understand. We're doing a lot of tough stuff. I completely understand. You got the board, you got the press. We didn't have a good year, and that's I think the kind of people you want. Every single one of them is looking at a tougher year, and is pretty much at this point, what can I do? What can I do? And throughout the whole last month, every single one of them, if their partner, who has nothing to do with them in a business that that isn't what they're responsible for, said, I need your help because your expertise, they would get in a car, go somewhere at midnight, down to the Fed or in some kind of thing. So we have a very competent, high integrity, try to do the right thing kind of team. We make plenty of mistakes. I agree with you. We always make long lists. Here's the mistakes we made. So we can be very honest about them, because there are a lot, and hopefully, that kind of team will pull you through whatever kind of crisis you have.
Great. Thank you. Anna, let me turn to you. You've certainly shown a lot of courage in the last 48 hours taking on this Madoff situation, and I think making this very, very major decision that you will back up your private clients' investments and recover 100% of that. That's a very, very bold leadership step that your group has taken. Can you share with us more about that? Because I know others have debated this same exact subject and come to a very different conclusion. Can you share with us kind of what values and principles went into this? And, this is a very courageous step.
Okay. I'd like to start by saying that, we have all of us, at least those that are old enough, like me, lived through tough times. But it's clear that these are quite exceptional times, and especially so for bankers, for the banking sector. And I'd like to start off giving my thoughts by something that I think Shakespeare said in Twelfth Night, that it's not exactly what he said, but more or less that some people are born leaders, some people achieve leadership, and some people have leadership thrust upon them. No? And clearly the key or the most interesting question is how do you achieve leadership? And I believe there are three very important things. The first one we tend to forget is proficiency, and this applies to all kinds of sectors, private and public. You need the knowledge, you need the technical capacity to get your job done, and this is very important. For us in banks, of course, this is to be proficient in risk management. And risk is not only credit, it's liquidity, it's operational, it's reputational, and I will mention Madoff in a few minutes. So again, for us in the bank, what we have done in my group is we spend, and I've been there for 20 of the 28 years I've been in banking, but we have an executive committee that every week meets, and we have executives and non-executives just to review risk. We also have a committee which meets twice a week, delegated from the board with a very independent risk function. They have a lot of power all the way down to the branch level, and they meet twice a week and review risk. The second very important quality, and of course proficiency is indispensable to this one, is confidence. I mean, leaders need to take decisions, many times very tough decisions. And it takes confidence to lead the way. It takes confidence to adapt to change and realize you made mistakes, the environment has changed, and therefore you have to change. And it takes a lot of confidence also to listen to other people and maybe take a different action of what you were thinking of doing. And I think this is also extremely important. An example of this in our group and in Banesto is 2.5 years ago when we decided to sell our real estate company. It was a huge profit for us, 1.2 billion, but it was also compromising profits. I mean, it was 10-15% less profit that year, and this is the kind of decision that might seem easy. You know, Spain was a bubble, but it was not so easy because you're foregoing profits in the short term. And again, it takes confidence to take these decisions. And there's one clear thing, none of us, and sometimes people forget that, we don't have all the information. We have to take decisions with incomplete information. Even if you read the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and you come to Davos, you don't have all the information. And so you have to assign probabilities and decide that, you know, what is the best course to take and decide, you know, this is the least risky or the best thing for us to do at the time. And finally, and this probably is the most important thing that we all have to do is to be committed. And this was mentioned before. I think you have to remain committed in the bad times to your mission, to your values, and we can have a whole discussion on values, to your constituents. For us, it's shareholders, but it's also employees, it's also customers, it's society, it's your product. You have to be, you know, committed to the products you sell. And again, for us, and there's many examples, but and some of them as easy as if to stay committed, you have to be close to your customers. Maybe in tough times, you have to be closer to them and stop doing other things. Commitment to a mission or to your customers, in Santander's case, means it was not an easy decision to stick with our customers in the Madoff case, even though we think that we didn't do, maybe we made mistakes. It's not possible to sell always to the right customer. But basically, we did it to protect our franchise and because we feel our responsibility to our customers. And there's, of course, many side effects of that decision. So I think these are the key issues. And at the end of the day, I think to stay committed to your customers and realize that even though you might be wrong, and we have been wrong, of course, maybe it was not the wrong decision. And when you take these kind of decisions, what we have to think is, well, we're going to assume risk in taking that route, but that it doesn't sink the ship. So I go back to the confidence and the probabilities. You never have all the information, so you have to make sure that the downside is not going to do something really, bad for you, your country, your company. So staying committed, I think, to this and commitment in leaders is critical to what you're supposed to be doing.
Well, it's a remarkable act of leadership. I think everyone these days, just about every corporation I know says we put our customers' interests first. We're primarily concerned about customers. But I think this is the real test when things don't go the way you want them. I'd like to turn to change this slightly now. In fact, Benjamin, you alluded to this, but to kind of engage all four of you in a discussion. Everything I hear and read and talking to people, everyone's saying, can we just get through this crisis? We just get through the next 6 months, just get through 2009, everything's going to be fine. And you alluded to the fact of, no, a real leader is going to shape where we come out. How are we going to come out of this thing at the other end? It's not just a question of getting through a credit crisis, getting the banks to lend again. What's the shape of the market going to look like? Where's the real growth going to come from? And, what is your position going to be? Can you get the structural things done that you need to get done? Can you use this crisis? So maybe some of the rest of you can speak to that question of how can you use this crisis, not just to get through it, but to shape things so we can really go into a period of sustained growth, either for our countries or institutions.
Well, I think you can and you should. It's a lot easier for Israel to do that as opposed to India. Or, if we had to, suppose you put me on top of the American economy or the Chinese economy. I don't know. I haven't been there, and you are so much part of the global economy that you're much more dependent on things to happen. But understand, we have an economy. We have 7 million people. So our per capita income is maybe $25,000, depending on how you measure it. So we're not a big economy, but we can move. We can actually use this crisis. We're taking a fairly developed economy, not a low-income economy. And what we need to get from the world markets and from the world capital markets is nothing. But this nothing, if we multiply this, whatever, little fraction by 2 times or 3 times, it makes an enormous impact on our own internal situation. So while it's irrelevant for the world markets, if we have capital flows inside Israel now, I think we will, if we do certain things I'll describe, then we can change our situation dramatically in a very short time. So we use the crisis not only to make internal changes, but to draw in from, if you will, the world economic bloodstream, more oxygen, more nourishment than we would in other times. So the crisis actually works for you if you're small and very, very focused. Now, the first thing, and therefore I'm not giving advice to the United States or to India. This is not my job right now. I intend to be elected. I hope I'll get elected in a few days to run this particular economy, to get it out of this crisis. I don't know if the crisis is going to be V-shaped. I hope it's not L-shaped. We had an L in Japan, a pretty long L. You know, it's probably U-shaped, but I don't particularly care. I'm interested how deep is the U. But right now, I want to make Israel a V, which is more or less what we did last time. To make it a V, we have to do certain things in my country. I can talk about that. And David would have to do, if he gets elected, or whoever is there has to do whatever is appropriate to Britain. And it's interesting that we're talking in terms of nation states. They're back. You know, they're back. So we have to, even though we're in a global economy, we also have finite units, and in my case, a very discrete unit. So the first thing we have to remember in doing this is what stays constant. What stays constant is a principle that has not changed from the tulip bulb bust to the NASDAQ bust to the current bust, and that is you have to earn over time more than you spend. I mean, you can't get away from this. You can't get away from it on a business level, or on a bank level, or on a national economy level, or on a global level. So you really have to be careful not to upset that apple cart. Yes, I know, for a time you can increase government spending. Or, yes, you can lower your taxes for a while in order to stimulate growth. But very quickly, you better be balanced. That has not changed. I don't accept any of the economic models that say that you can really ditch this fundamental truth, because I think all our problems relate in one way or another to very sophisticated ways of saying this is not true, what I've just said. But it is true. So you better be able to, one, control the spending, because if you don't do that, I don't think we go very far. And that's politically the most difficult thing for political leaders. Two, we've got to solve the credit crunch. In my country, I think it's easier. Our banks didn't sink low enough, happily. And we also have some credit guarantees that have been left over from the previous crisis that we had, U.S. loan guarantees that we didn't use, and other things. But we have to get the banks to lend and to get outside banking credit sources. That's the second point. The third point is use your advantage. We have an R&D capability, very limited spending, limited on the national budget, keeps your main advantage at home. You don't let these people leave, and you start raiding the Israeli entrepreneurs, high-tech entrepreneurs, not raiding, let's call them, let's say, inviting them back home. With a very small amount of spending, but very focused, you can keep the heart of your machine, of your competitive machine, and you can augment it. You can bring it. So that's what I would do. And they're in trouble in Silicon Valley. They're in trouble in Route 128. Haven't checked Cambridge recently, but we will. Very important, R&D.
We like those Israeli entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I know. And we want them back. And it's not only that we want to keep them from going, we want them back. And I think this is an opportunity to get them with very focused spending. Fourth is very boring. Very, very boring. It's real estate. We have one of the tiniest countries in the world, and 93% of the land is controlled by a government monopoly. That creates pent-up demand, and Hong Kong prices ridiculous. And we're going to change that. Change the building boards. Real big reforms that we've been waiting for many years to do this, and I really want to get my hands into this, and simultaneously push fast roads and railroads. Simple things, but when investors from Dubai or Hong Kong see that in Israel or Britain, they see that in Israel you're going to open up pieces of land and you're running a fast road or a fast highway there, economic value has just been created. And you say, well, they don't have to invest there. Yeah, but it's a sure thing. They will. And simultaneously we'll connect the Mediterranean, our Mediterranean ports with our Red Sea ports, a project that was frozen when I left the finance ministry. The reason that's important is it creates an alternative route for shipping of Asian products to European markets when the economy will come back. It will come back. So this is a good time to do these things. This is, again, part of the vision that says we come out of this much stronger than we came into this, and we can do this with very clear directions, and here's what we're going to do. And we're not going to go crazy in dislocating spending from income. We're just not going to do that. I think that's what we're going to do if we come into office. There's a still small hurdle there. We have to get elected.
12 days. So, Jamie, I think it's fair to say that the shape of banking in the United States and around the world has changed irrevocably as a result of what's happened this past year. How do you see JPMorgan Chase's position coming out of this, and how do you see shaping the banking system so that it will be healthier and stronger coming out of this, so that it can spur U.S. growth and not have the kind of situation we have right now?
Right. So, I think one of the most important things to fixing a crisis is actually acknowledging all the issues. And Albert Einstein said, keep things as simple as possible, no simpler. So I've been around Davos for a couple of days. I take full blame for all the American banks and all the things they did, and because I hear it's a very simple way of looking at this crisis. Yes, God knows some really stupid things were done, okay, by American banks and by American investment banks. But when you sit back, how many of you, just interact real quick, how many of you moved money from something kind of risky to something very conservative recently? Just raise your hands real quickly. It was you too. Okay, because it wasn't banks that stopped lending. It's a great misnomer. Money funds. A lot of people took money out of money funds. They lend to GE, and they lend to Israeli companies, they lend to UK companies, and there's a long list of issues and problems coming out of this. Okay, we had too much leverage in the system. We knew that. That was banks, far more in European banks than American banks, and that's not fixed yet. Okay, it was hedge funds, it was investment banks, it was obviously the consumer. And then we gave them the weapons of mass destruction to borrow too much, okay? But I've also said, where were the I'm not blaming, I blame the CEOs for their own businesses. I don't blame anyone else. But as a policymaker, I'd say, well, where were they? They approved Basel II, which didn't work. They approved all these things. Everything's supposed to be hunky-dory, and now they're the ones beating up on everyone saying, look at all these mistakes, and we're going to come fix it. And there were problems with accounting, CIVs, on balance sheet, off balance sheet. The beautiful part, and I am very uncomfortable, waiting for crisis to get better, because, people, someone's quote, I think it's the right quote, don't waste a good crisis. Right. But the American policy on trade, well, hell, we knew years ago that was bad, that you can't run these huge negative trade deficits for years, and there was a lot of theory about, well, it's going to nicely sort itself out, and it's, capital flows and balances, and, then you have the Chinese blaming the Americans blaming the Chinese. Well, it was an imbalance that both benefited from and both are losing from. So I think it's kind of immature and childish to act like one was to blame. One was the other. It was just simply the other side of the coin. So, it's a long list of problems, and how this is going to change over time. JPMorgan will be fine. JPMorgan will be fine if everyone stops talking about damn nationalization of banks. We got plenty of capital. We're properly marked. We're serious covers left and right. JPMorgan, the last 90 days. This thing about banks not lending money, because it's said is we lent $150 billion. New capital, new credit, $50 billion in the interbank markets. That's to other banks. Now, if you're on my board of directors, you say you lent $50 billion to those other bad banks, including European banks and UK banks, and yeah, we're out doing business every day, making loans, credit cards and consumer loans and auto loans and corporate loans, and it's scary, because at the end of the day we have to survive, and I'm always quite conscious of how important it's to survive. So. the survival, again, it's how you go into the crisis. We had plenty of capital, conservative county, a very good management team. We weren't in too many businesses. We try to keep our focus. And you know what? If you were a management team meeting of ours, you would look back and say, these guys are terrible. Because I focus on the negatives. What are the problems? If you come to my office and start telling me how great a job you did, I'm going to just kick you out. What's the problem? Let's get it done. Let's be honest. Let's get the right people in the room. And I wish the policymakers, because I've been dealing with it now for a year and a half. Policy's been catch as catch can. When everyone writes a book on how to fix the thing, the G30, the meeting, they're going to meet here. You got these 1-hour meetings. You got the IIF, the FSRT, and well, hell, I haven't yet seen people get all the right people in the room, close the damn door, put all the problems in the wall, and come up with a solution. It's sitting right in front of us. It is right in front of us. And I just wish we would get around and get to it now because this is getting a little old.
Good. Thank you. This stage, I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. If you have any questions for Anna or David, any of our panelists, anyone have a first question? Yes, sir. You have microphones coming right up.
Yes, this is a question for Mr. Netanyahu. You laid out the big three very well, but what happens if a visionary, courageous political leader has been dealt a weak hand politically? If he has a limited mandate or a very weak coalition? What skills are called upon then?
Well, come and vote, That's very hard. It's the big three. You need the big three. You need sufficient political power, and you need. It probably means that you can actually compensate for that with the other two. That is, you'll have to sacrifice parts of your body politic, your own body, your own political credit, in order to make up for it. Because what you lack in political power, you have to make up with vision and courage, and just try to sweep the rest. Look, we took a very recalcitrant party, my own party, that was wedded to certain conceptions of welfare, and we did very, very difficult welfare changes. And I have to tell you, the result was that people said you'd be punished, and we were. We lost an election partly on this. So I don't have an easy answer to give you. You have to have all of the three as much as you can. If you have less political power than you'd like, then make up for it with the other two. But at the end of the day, you have to decide what you're there for. You don't want to spend your time, at least I don't, just sitting in the seat of power and not exercising it for a real purpose. And it's the same thing about leadership. Leadership is not occupying the positions, the formal positions of leadership. You could be a university president, and you could be not a leader, or you could be a leader. The same applies to a general, and the same applies to political leaders. The formal position gives you an opportunity to lead. It only gives you the opportunity to lead. It doesn't assure that you lead. Real leadership is taking the positions of power that you're entrusted with and then forcing through a change. If you're not changing, what are you there for? If you're just running, ahead of the herd in the same direction, you're not a leader, you're a follower. But it's when you have to change the course. The real test of leadership is when you have to change course. And the simplest way to change course, to get people to follow you to a different course, is when they're in a crisis. Because in a crisis, people open their minds and their hearts. They're more attuned to a different change. Now, in this particular thing, I mentioned the things that I wanted to do, but I also add something that is not commonly acceptable. We're going to drive taxes down very fast. We already did. I took the maximal tax rate. The last time we had a conference, there was a big change. In Israel, this was really controversial. We had 62% top market tax, okay, in the last crisis because they wanted to raise taxes to get tax revenues, and as the government's coffers were being depleted, 2003. I brought it down immediately, not immediately, but over several years, to 46%. Now I'm going to bring it down to 35%. We don't have state taxes or anything like that. And this will be an average 20% reduction for all people. And people are saying, how are you going to pay for this? You know, I'm going to pay for it for growth. How am I going to get growth? I'm going to get it from the other things. And as I go down, I tailor the rate of bringing down taxes. I had a big argument with the IMF about this. Big argument, including with my colleague Stanley Fisher, who I subsequently recommended to come in as the governor of the Bank of Israel. And there was a difference of views. The IMF said if you lower taxes in a declining economy, you will create bigger deficits. And I said, no, I think I'll bring the debt to GDP ratio down. We brought it down from 102% to 75%, 76%. It's the first real decline in Israel's history. We're going to bring down taxes. There's a big risk involved in that too. And it's not necessarily popular in Israel for peculiar reasons. Okay? So you take the power that you have, the vision that you have, and you drive it to the end. The main thing is use the crisis right away. Time is a factor. Do not wait. If you know where you're going, go there as rapidly as you can once you're in power. There's the awe, the shock and awe of an election victory. Don't waste it. Part of the way that you make up for less political power that you want is time. Use time very decisively.
Very, very clear. David, do you want to comment on that?
And I agree with that. I think that's right. I just wanted to make a comment on the earlier point you were asking about where does the growth come from. And I think it's very important that we use the crisis to try and address the imbalances in the global economy and in our own national economies, because otherwise all we'll do is we'll just reflate the bubble and sow the seeds of a similar crisis later on. If we don't solve the problem of excessive saving in the East and excessive borrowing in the West, if we don't solve the problem in our own economy of too much growth coming from housing, finance and government spending and not enough from other sectors, then the problem will just reoccur all over again. So I think this rebalancing is what is required. I completely agree with in politics, your authority comes from the opportunity you get after being elected, and you've got to turn that capital into action very quickly because it's a declining asset. And you can see politicians that succeed because they take their first 3 months, the first 6 months, and they take difficult decisions, they get on with the job, they roll up the sleeves, they do things that they can trade their temporary popularity to do difficult things. And certainly the challenge we will face if we get elected, whenever the election is, with the deficit already 8% of GDP, probably rising if the government do another fiscal stimulus in March, April this year, the challenge of getting the public finances back on a sustainable footing, of getting debt under control, of doing this at a time when the economy is still fragile, is going to be enormously difficult. But I think it'll be one of the keys to getting confidence back. So Bibi's right. You don't occupy, even being a party leader, it's a pointless, well, opposition is particularly pointless. It's a pointless job unless you're trying to do something and change something. In my case, it was to change my party, to get it back into the game and to challenge on issues like the environment, which Conservatives hadn't spoken about, and tackling poverty. But you've got to use your power, use your office for a purpose. And it's a bit like, sort of, they say if sharks stop moving, politics is a bit the same. If you stop changing, if you stop acting, you lose actually your authority, your ability to get things done.
Great, thank you. Next question. Yes. Have a question? Have a microphone here? Question here. Yes, sir.
Yes, to Mr. Netanyahu. You laid out a clear vision on what you'll do in the economy. Could you share with us your view on what you will do to achieve a lasting peace in Gaza?
Just as the problem in the economy is related to the broader context of the world economy and your place in it, the same applies to the problem we've had in Gaza. It's not an isolated problem. Hamas is not an isolated body. It is a militant Islamic movement committed to our destruction. But even that doesn't make it, and it uses the tactic of firing rockets from rocketeers embedded in civilian populations on our civilian populations. that doesn't describe where do they get the rockets from. They get it from Iran. Where do they get the money? They get it from Iran, 80%. Where do they get political support? They get it from Iran. They've become a Sunni proxy for a militant Shiite regime, unusual. Same applies to Hezbollah in our north, where we had a war. We've had 2 wars with 2 Iranian proxies in 2 years. You know, Persia has now 2 bases on the Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean, the same they had in Alexandrian times. They had one in Lebanon, one in Gaza. And they used them, first against us, but not solely against us, obviously. So from both places, they've embedded basically their proxies. Hezbollah is a Shiite proxy of a Shiite mother terrorist regime, and Hamastan, a term I coined after our departure from Gaza, Hamastan is a Sunni terror proxy of this mother Shiite regime. And they are, from both of them, they fired about 10,000 rockets into our territory, into the Galilee and into the southern part of the country, now reaching into the outskirts of Tel Aviv. I think in order to deal with this, we're going to have to deal with neutralizing the power of the mother regime. The Hamas stronghold would be about as important if Iranian power was neutralized as Cuba was when the Soviet Union became irrelevant. It would dissipate and wither away as a force of consequence. The same would be true of Hezbollah. But if Iran proceeds successfully in its race, its real dash, now it's a 100-yard dash, that's what's left, to acquire nuclear weapons, then these proxies will engage in terror against us and others enjoying a nuclear umbrella. So the biggest issue facing our time, by far the biggest issue facing our time, is not the extent of the current financial crisis, because as was said here correctly, and with able people, in the private sector and in governments, and there are now able people, I think, in many, many places around the world, it'll eventually. It's reversible because people get married, they have children, they have houses, they act in economic activities that produce value added, and more people are doing it. Another billion people in Asia will enter, and these facts are they're going to drive, irresistibly drive a correction. But what is not reversible is the acquisition of nuclear weapons by a fanatic radical regime committed to a crazy pre-medieval idea of the world, which they are supposed to dominate. We've never had, since the dawn of the nuclear age, nuclear weapons in the hands of such a fanatical regime. Every one of them, even Stalin, was very much susceptible to the cost and calculation of cost and benefit, especially cost, of a nuclear exchange. It's not clear that the Ayatollah regime will be equally susceptible to this calculation, which means that if there's one mission that we have to put before us, those of us who go to positions of national and international leadership, it is to prevent the arming of Iran with nuclear weapons. That would also enable us to neutralize Iran's proxies. If we neutralize Iran proxies, and parallel to neutralizing Iran's proxies, we have to move rapidly to advance a workable peace with the Palestinian moderates, talking about the Palestinian Authority. There's one thing that you have to see, which I think is a silver lining in what happened. We didn't see a breakout, uncontrolled breakout in the West Bank. You have to ask that. Sherlock Holmes, that story of the. Well, I didn't say that.
We're going to have to.
But what I want to say is they obviously have a choice between being dominated by these Hamas militant Islamic people or working with us to kick up their economy, kick up their security, make workable agreements, political agreements with us so that people have a stake in the future. And thereby, you strengthen the moderates, you drive down the radicals, and you can, in my opinion, create a corridor to a final settlement of peace between us and the Palestinians, using the economy, using security, and keeping Iran and its proxies at bay. All of this will fall by the wayside if the world fails to stop Iran from arming itself with nuclear weapons. That was and remains the greatest challenge facing the leaders of the 21st century, the beginning of the 21st century.
Thank you. That's very clear. I think we could easily go on another hour, and this is going to have to be wrapping up shortly. But just one final comment, Anna, do you have you'd like to make? And
well, just going back to the to another level, to the financial crisis, I think it's clear that we all know what we think we have to do, and just going to Europe, which is maybe a few months behind the U.S., but we have our own problems. The U.S., the U.K., they have leaders. In Europe, we have many leaders, and I think in Europe we need cooperation, we need common rules, but we also have country-specific problems we must deal with. But it's critical that we sit down and discuss what are these guidelines. And just as an example, we need to have a level playing field. In some cases, the stronger banks, some of the Spanish banks, we're paying more for our funding because some of the banks that were or have been partly nationalized have an implicit government guarantee. So these kind of issues can distort the economies of Europe. And for us to get back lending and to tell a bank they don't want to lend is like telling Toyota they don't want to sell cars. Of course we want to lend. But we need to have the right conditions. And again, we know what the general solutions are. We need to get down and execute them. And again, for Europe, that's much tougher because we need to. Germany is not Spain. The problems are very different. We have different underlying, let's say, bad assets. So we need common guidelines, local execution, and for this we need to sit down and agree on those guidelines and then allow the national governments to go ahead and do it. And Europe is not the US, but if Europe doesn't get solved, I think we still have a problem for a long time.
Good. Thank you. David, quick comment, just to close here.
Well, I'm not going to... Bibi and I are having a separate meeting about Israel, so we can discuss those. I think it's important just to respond to what Anna said. Obviously, there is international cooperation that's got to take place, but I think it's very important that individual countries don't try and sort of slide out of their own responsibilities by saying, well, this can only be solved if we, have amendment to the Basel rules. We've got to look at what happened in our own countries in terms of the regulatory failures. I think Jamie's right to say it's ridiculous just to blame the banks. You've got to look at the regulatory system and how that failed. I think in the UK case, what people are now looking at more and more is the non-bank sector, which was responsible for a huge amount of lending and leverage, and that has effectively disappeared, and that's what's left such a big hole. And you've got to ask yourself, well, what is the solution to that? Do you want a sort of structural solution for how we try and structure our financial industry in the future? I think that's very difficult to achieve because you want innovation in finance. Therefore, it has to be more of a regulatory solution. And part of that regulation has to be national regulation. I think we'd be getting it wrong if we thought that somehow you could do all of this at the European level or at some international level, whereas actually, if we look at our own countries, we can all see mistakes that were made in individual institutions, individual banks, individual decisions. And as a part of that, you need a regulator close to that market, and the regulator has to regulate the overall market, not just the institutions. And that means that to that extent, the nation-state is still very important in this picture.
Thank you. Jamie, final comment from you?
The only thing I say is I think for countries and companies and, the most important thing when you have a crisis is that you learn from it, you reform, and you change. And it's not true for every country. You see a lot of countries, they kind of use it. It's used for political reasons to gain pressure over here or something like that, and countries get stuck. And the United States, if you look at the United States, it's had tremendous ups and downs the last 100, 200 years. But it's always had the ability to learn from it, change, reform, and move on. And I would guess, if I were you folks, I wouldn't sell the United States short. My guess is it'll do that quickly and come out as first. But we obviously need to do it right away.
Well, we all hope you succeed.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, the one thing, just to conclude...
We hope you succeed, too.
The one thing I would conclude from all of this is that we need to recognize it's not about the blame game. We have a lot of leaders today who are spending a lot of time blaming, and we have plenty of media go around to write about this. I think The real test is how we can step up to this leadership crisis and come out of it a lot stronger, because we learned from the lessons and we can put the things in place that will permanently put us on a growth path in all of our countries and throughout the world. But that is the test of leadership, and why we need the kind of leaders we have up here who are courageous, who are going to put their constituents and their customers first, and have the courage to stand in the face of opposition. Because if you just go with the flow, you certainly won't have leadership. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, same thing to you.